This video will be part 1 of Chapter 4 in Research Methods in Psychology for PSY 222, Research Methods for the Psychological Sciences. This chapter will be looking at how do we as psychological scientists do the task of observation. First, we need to define what we mean by scientific observation, because there's all kinds of observing. There's all kinds of ways of watching behavior, listening to behavior, and we need to make a distinction between casual everyday observation and even the everyday act of drawing conclusions. We need to draw a contrast between that and the scientific version of observation. So everyday observations are not the same thing as making scientific observations in a clear and objective way. Scientific observation means that you have to have really clear, precise definitions of the constructs that you're measuring, and that's often particularly challenging for psychology. We have many constructs that are open to interpretation, that have multi-layered definitions. I think the example that they used in your text was about defining intelligence, which is a very vexing concept because it has multiple layers and different ways of being approached. And it's also a convoluted cultural construct as well. So when we think about scientific observation, we need to understand, as scientists, we have to be able to measure precisely. We have to have careful and clear definitions. Our measurements and the way in which we make our observations, we need to be systematic and objective in doing so. The goal when we're observing, and it doesn't matter whether you're doing observations out in the field like Jane Goodall watching chimpanzees, it doesn't matter if you're doing that or if you are observing people's attitudes in a different sort of way, such as using questionnaires or surveys. The goal is to describe behavior that you're interested in understanding better. If you go back a couple chapters to where we talked about those goals of science, observation is the first of those goals. Until you can very clearly and objectively, precisely observe behavior and record it, you can't go on to the other two goals, which is prediction and explanation. So the first step in many ways, even if your ultimate goal is to explain behavior, is to be able to very carefully and objectively observe it. Now, all of that said, researchers cannot observe certain things. So you can't, as a researcher, have access to all of a person's behaviors. We have to select. You couldn't possibly examine and record every single behavior of a person's repertoire, nor can you have access to all people. Even within a sample, you can't have access to all individuals' behaviors, nor can you have access to every single observable expressed by all of the people in that sample. What we can observe, however, is we can take samples of individuals, and within those samples, we can look at individual behaviors at a specific time. So essentially what we're doing is snapshotting. We've selected a sample of people to represent a larger population. Then we sample their actions, their behaviors, their cognitions, their emotions at specifically defined times or in specific contexts. So what we have to remember what we are capable of doing and what we're not capable of doing as observers. When we sample, we acknowledge the fact that we can't get a complete record of behavior. Now there's one exception to this. If you're doing very complex behavioral recording of an individual across a long period of time, so for example, if you're doing applied behavioral analysis work with a child, for example, you're not observing every single behavior exhibited by that child, However, you're doing a far more intensive, individualized record of that child's specific behaviors. You're typically choosing which behaviors you're going to observe and record and keep records of, however. So if we acknowledge the fact that the complete record of behavior can't be obtained, then what we try to do is to get a representative sample of the behaviors exhibited if you're looking at an individual, a representative sample of the behaviors in that individual, or if you're looking at it from a group level, a representative sample of individuals who can represent the population that you're interested in. Now, as your authors put it, the extent to which observations can be generalized, which refers to a concept that you already know, and that's called external validity. That's going to, the degree to which you can do that and do it well depends on how you've sampled the behaviors themselves. So how you've gone about acquiring those behaviors, how you've gone about observing those behaviors is going to have a direct impact on the degree of external validity that you can argue you have. Now, just to remind us all, what do we mean by external validity? External validity refers to how well can you take your results and then assume or extrapolate from those results to the broader population or to multiple settings or to different kinds of conditions. So, for example, in a lot of the research in altruism or helping behavior, some of the original research was done in a laboratory setting where emergencies were staged, and they basically manipulated the variable of how many people are present, and then they timed how long it took for people to render assistance to someone who was ill or got help when they detected that maybe there was a fire. Then you have to kind of look at the circumstances of that laboratory-based study and ask yourself the question, how well would that generalize to non-college student populations, because the original studies were done with college students? How well would it generalize to a non-psychology laboratory context? And under what conditions would the bystander effect hold? So the question with external validity is, if I take my finding out into the big, bad, messy, multiple variables running at the same time world, am I going to find basically the same thing? Time sampling, as your authors describe it, involves researchers selecting certain time intervals. It could be very short intervals, it could be longer intervals, but they're choosing time intervals for making observations. Sometimes these time intervals are randomly determined, sometimes they are systematically determined to be all equivalent. But the idea is that you want to be able to capture behavior across a range of times. So you need to make some selections about what time frames you're going to use. So if we systematically select time intervals, as in the case here, if I want to make my observations the first day of every week, I could do that, or I could do it randomly, or I could vary whether I was going to go random or systematic. For example, and I'm reminded of this because I had some SCE researchers, some of my seniors, who were interested in gratitude research. So the effect of gratitude on things like well-being or life satisfaction. And some of the articles that they read, they used this kind of time sampling procedure, the researchers did, where participants were to record their thoughts first thing in the morning every Monday morning. So that's an example of a systematic. Now, other gratitude researchers, they gave their participants a little pager, which is so totally before your time. If we were doing a similar study today, we would probably text people. But they were given this pager, and whenever the pager went off, and the pagers were designed to go off randomly during the daylight hours, whenever the pager went off, they were to record a gratitude thought in their notebook, and then those notebooks were later collected as a source of data. So that's just a simple, concrete example of how time sampling might work. Whether you're talking about systematic or random, they have advantages and disadvantages. As a result, they're sometimes combined. So there might be some stable intervals that are scheduled systematically, but then there might be other moments within that method that are completely random. For example, in the gratitude research, you could have those every Monday morning, first thing in the morning records that people put in their notebook, and combine it with some random check-ins for gratitude thoughts across the week. Time sampling is not your best choice when you are trying to look at a behavior that is rare, because the chances are good that you will not encounter it at those particular times when you're sampling it. If you're looking for a rare behavior, then sampling at either systematic or random times is likely to get you a lot of no data. So if you're interested in rare behaviors, event sampling is more likely to be your method of choice, or to sample behaviors. And so it's a different procedure. If it's a rare behavior, then you're going to want to kind of decode what are the parameters of the event that's most likely associated with this particular behavior, and to sample from those events. There is something called situation sampling, and what's involved here in terms of making your observations is studying behaviors in locations that vary, and doing so under different conditions. I'll go back to the research on helping behavior. One of the things that these researchers did very brilliantly was to study the same behavior, people's willingness to render assistance to a stranger. They kind of took their basic model that had worked in a laboratory with college students and took it to the streets, setting up mock emergencies or just situations where people needed assistance in shopping malls, in subway cars, in buses, on the street, in rural environments, in urban environments, all kinds of contexts. So in that case, you're observing helping behavior across a variety of situations. It's called sampling, not because you're creating a sample of people, but you're taking a snapshot of behaviors in varying situations. Now, it may not be that you're looking at these behaviors under situations where you're manipulating an independent variable, such as staging an emergency. You may just be interested in patterns. So, for example, since we all have to wear masks when we're out in public places now, mostly when we're indoors, you do a lot of situation sampling informally yourself. Researchers are probably doing so more systematically. So going to various stores in an area, visiting them, and then across different situations, like comparing restaurant environments versus grocery store environments versus outdoor venues, indoor venues, what's the density of mask wearing in those environments. And that can be informative because you're looking at the rate of mask wearing that can be observed and counted across different kinds of situations. By doing this, when we look at different situations, what you're doing as a researcher is helping yourself to understand whether or not their results are only tethered to certain kinds of situations. So let's say you're interested in the rate of mask wearing in Stark County during the middle of September. If you only went to grocery stores and didn't go to other kinds of venues, other situations, you would have a biased rendering. Also, if you only went to grocery stores in a specific part of Stark County, you wouldn't have the ability to know whether or not the situation that you were sampling was simply odd, because local norms would have an impact on your behavior. I remember right during the very beginning of the mask mandate, and before it was really being put into place in businesses. So it was before the governor of Ohio, said if you're going into businesses, you have to wear a mask. There were stark differences between my grocery store that I usually go to, where most people were wearing masks. Probably about 30% were not. Contrast that with when I went to my favorite farm supply store to get dog food, and I was the only one wearing a mask. So that's a difference between different situations that have different situational norms. So when your authors talk about the need to sample various situations so that your results are not just connected to the uniqueness of the one situation that you looked at, that's what they're trying to avoid. You also need to think about the fact that there are lots of situations where you have lots of different kinds of behaviors. And since human beings are always annoyingly complex, the challenge that you have as a researcher is to sort them, is to decide which behaviors to focus on and which behaviors you can ignore. And if, say, the observation, the potential behaviors that you could observe, if they are hidden or they're just embedded in a complicated environment, then it's more challenging. Or let's say you're interested in what people say to each other. If the situation is simply too noisy for you to hear, that's a problem in terms of situation sampling. Also, just the density of the crowding. If you have a real complicated social situation, it'd be hard to observe. In situations like that, subject sampling may be more useful. So let's say you have a very crowded environment and you're making observations of certain kinds of behaviors, but there are just too many people to do recordings with any kind of consistency or accuracy. What you may do as the observer is to select, using criteria, certain individuals within that situation and record their behaviors instead of recording all of them. Now, when we think about observational methods, they can be categorized, and I've captured this image from your text so that you can think about the way in which we categorize these methods carefully. So all of these methods are observational. Sometimes what we're observing directly, sometimes we're observing indirectly. Direct means what you think it means. It means you actually see or hear the behavior that you're interested in. Sometimes when we make these observations, we aren't intervening. We're not throwing variables in and manipulating them such that we can then test the effect of an independent variable. So we're just watching. So if I was that researcher interested in the rate of mask wearing in grocery stores in the state of Ohio, I could do naturalistic observation where I have my team of researchers deployed out to grocery stores all over the state and have them observe for different periods of time across the hours during which the stores are open, and to record the percentage of people entering into the store who put their masks on. That could be a naturalistic observation study. Not a really well-designed one, but I'm talking off the top of my head. Observation with intervention is like the examples of the helping behavior studies that I've used earlier in this lecture, where you're going to stage an event and you're going to see what happens. There are other helping behavior studies, like if you wanted to study littering behavior or recycling, putting objects into recycling. If that's your behavior of interest and you want to increase that, you could do an observation with intervention by changing messaging, by manipulating the norms on the ground, for instance, how much trash seems to be around, and seeing the impact on either not throwing trash on the ground or actually contributing to the litter, or if the location is actually clean, meaning the norm is not to throw trash around, then you might be able to demonstrate that increases the likelihood of putting trash in trash cans. Sometimes observation with intervention means that you are a participant in the activity that's going on. So for example, some colleagues of mine and we all participated in the Women's March on Washington after the 2016 election. We also collected data while we were there. In many ways, we were participant observers of the event. You can also have structured observations and field experiments that we're going to talk about more here in a bit. In indirect observation, the behaviors have already occurred. They're not happening live. They've already occurred. So what you're looking at is, in some cases, physical traces that are records of a sort that you can make inferences about in terms of what they mean. And then there are also archival records that we'll go into in the second part of this lecture. Direct observation without intervention is exactly what it sounds like. You are observing behaviors as they naturally occur in the real world, in the setting in which they naturally occur. You, as the observer, try to be as inobtrusive as possible. In some cases, you try to be invisible by observing from discrete locations, or in fact using technology so that you can be literally invisible to those who are behaving. So you, as a researcher, are not intervening, you're not changing the situation. Any attempt on your part to influence the situation would be changing the methodology. Our goal when we do naturalistic observation is to try and create a rich record of the behavior that we're interested in as it naturally occurs. The types of things that you might want to record are not just the behavior of interest, but also the qualities of it. For example, this is way back in completely the beginning of my career, one of the first SCEs that I was an advisor for, the students were interested in aggressive behavior in toddlers in a daycare environment. So what we set up with a local daycare was an observation space. Then they needed to decide how were they going to code these behaviors on their little clipboard. So they had to decide a definition for aggressive, and then they had to break it down into categories of what they meant. They also had to decide, when you say toddler, what do you mean? Do you mean 18-month to 4-year-olds? And eventually that's what they decided. There were actually classrooms designated in the particular daycare that they were observing, and they wanted to see specific kinds of behaviors, such as pushing, shoving, shouting, slapping, kicking, and they had a whole checklist so that they could keep a tally of how many of these behaviors were exhibited by the children. And on their coding sheets, they labeled the kids, with a code like A, B, C, D, and so on, and they kept very limited demographic information. They were primarily interested in gender, so they recorded the gender of the children. And then they sat unobtrusively off to the side of a room with their coding sheets, and they simply watched. Once they've gotten and they watched during free play time periods for each class of kids who ranged in age from 18 to 4 in their own classroom groupings. And then they, coded the data. So that's an example of, watching behaviors that normally occur. So these are toddlers, they're in free play periods, they're in a mixed sex group, and they're of different ages. And what's being documented are physically aggressive behaviors in conflicts between the children. What they also noted, they also wanted to note some possible relationships between variables. So they recorded at the bottom of their coding sheets any kind of incidentals, like how involved was the teacher, because that's a potential variable for further exploration down the road. Were there any interesting extenuating circumstances? Were there any external stressors? Were there a high number or a low number of people present that day, and so on? So they recorded those things because they could be potentially interesting down the road. They also wanted to look, this particular group of researchers, they wanted to know if the majority of the toddlers in a given play group were male, would there be more aggressive play than if the play group was predominantly female? It was a hypothesis. It was proven false. But they wanted to see, are they related? Is the gender balance within a play group going to be somehow predictive of the amount of physically aggressive play? When we do direct observation with intervention, and most of the observational research in psychology is going to involve the manipulation of some kind of variable, as opposed to doing naturalistic observation, which is far more common in sociology and anthropology. With intervention, we have options, just like in the flow chart that I showed you earlier. You can do participant observations, structured observations, and field experiments. Sometimes your participation can be disguised, so going in not costume per se, unless you're studying cosplay. If you're a researcher and you want to study the world of cosplay, you have to cosplay, because you will not be unobtrusive if you do that. But I don't know why I thought of that. I should probably edit that out. But anyway, when you're a participant observer, since you're embedded literally in the situation, it's kind of like being an embedded reporter. You're in it, you're part of it, and you have a more organic experience of what the participants that you're interested in are experiencing. If people know that they're being observed, so let's say I want to study the cosplay environment, but I don't go in costume, I'm going to stand out like a sore thumb. And if I'm standing there with a clipboard and, heaven forbid, a micro recorder, I'm really going to stand out, and that means that the people I'm attempting to observe are likely to change their behavior. They may censor their behavior, they may restrict their behavior, they may move away from me. All of that is reactivity. So in that case, if you want to study that behavior as a kind of an embedded member of the group, blending is necessary and is an advantage so that you don't spark reactivity in your potential participants. These kinds of methodologies are sometimes used by clinicians if they're interested in the sort of organic expression of behavior, sometimes by developmentalists as well, who may set up structured situations so that they can record behaviors. The example I described to you earlier of the daycare observation, they were doing a fairly structured set of recordings of behaviors. Since it would be unwieldy and difficult to be out in the world where kids naturally roam, using an educational environment to structure the behavior was helpful. And it's not nearly as messy. You know, you have kids in a group, in a small room, engaged in free play. It's not completely naturalistic, but it is naturalistic enough. So we often see these kinds of studies in clinical and developmental research. As a social psychologist, I see them in my world as well. But more likely, in social psych, it's going to be a field experiment where you're actually manipulating an independent variable and measuring a dependent variable of interest. So in field experiments, what we're doing is carefully manipulating one or more independent variables in that setting and then measuring a specific set of behaviors of interest. A little bit more about participant observation. In participant observation, you as the observer are actually playing more than one role. You're in it. You're in the situation. So when my colleagues and I were on the Women's March, we were on the Women's March. We had our pussy hats on. We had our hiking boots on. We were in the march. We were in the crowd. And we were simultaneously recording behavior. We weren't videoing or anything like that. We had handed out cards asking people to give us their thoughts on an online questionnaire. We also, though, we took moments during the time that we were marching to record our thoughts, our own thoughts, as we were going through that experience. When you have an undisguised participant, so this would be the case in the daycare study that I described before, although toddlers are not typically all that bothered by a stranger hanging out in their classroom. They're used to classroom observers. Still though, my students were not pretending to be teachers. They were not pretending to be employees. They were just, an adult young person sitting in the corner with a clipboard. For the other adults in the room, they know exactly what those people were and who they were. So that's an undisguised participant. You're in the room, and frequently my students in their observer role, they were in that playroom. Kids would come over, they would talk to them, they would sometimes engage them in play, like a ball would roll to their feet, they would throw it back. So in a way, you're an undisguised participant in that case. Disguised participants, as I described earlier, you are play acting. It's kind of like being an undercover cop. You are embedding yourself in the situation, pretending to be a full participant in whatever the situation is that you're interested in. Doing participant observation, the real value of it is you get a really rich supply of data as it is of observations of behavior as they're naturally occurring. And in that sense, you get a really real, rich experience. However, it's very tethered to the time and place and moment that you're capable of observing. Another challenge with participant observation is it can really be a challenge to your objectivity. Any of your biases as an observer are going to be something that you have to fight against as an observer, and that's why it's really important for you to go in with a data collection plan that you don't deviate from. So my students who were observing toddlers and they were interested in aggressive behaviors, they had to think through exactly what aggressive behavior meant to them. They created a coding system and they were not permitted to deviate from that system once they walked in the room. The reason why we have to really up our objectivity game and create some structure for ourselves as observers is because we have the power, just by being human beings in a social situation, to influence the behavior of the people we are observing. So we have to take measures to prevent that from happening, and that's a real challenge in participant observation. Now, structured observation And I put this picture here because you can have some fun if you go onto YouTube and type in hidden gorilla or invisible gorilla and watch the videos. There's a whole series of these kinds of situations where researchers have studied something called inattention bias. And you get the still shot here of a guy in a gorilla suit who walks in the middle of people appearing to play basketball. If you watch it in real time, what happens is that the people are to throw the basketball to their same colored shirt participants, and they have to really focus. There's a pattern how they're supposed to move around the room, and they have to really focus their attention on who they're throwing the ball to. And then the gorilla suit guy just sort of saunters across the room, and what's been found is that a good portion of the time nobody notices the gorilla, which is, you don't believe me unless you've seen it, so I encourage you to look it up and watch it happen. It's an example of a structured observation kind of context, where you're structuring the situation and then testing a hypothesis. So these types of procedures are not the same as naturalistic observation because the researchers are creating an intervention and then they're documenting what happens as a result. How much intervention is involved and how much control over the events, that varies. And it's not typically quite as much control over the situation as what you would see in a field experiment, where they tend to be a bit more elaborate and there are more variables that are being controlled. Often the observer, the person who's recording the observation, will do the intervening in order to set up a certain kind of situation. There have been a number of these inattention bias studies. For instance, in a busy retail establishment, some of the inattention bias researchers would, they would have, imagine you're the person who goes into your local cell phone store and you have a problem with your phone and you're working with the salesperson one-on-one, and the inattention bias researchers at some point during your interaction with the person, they would have the salesperson would stoop down under the counter where you can't see them, and then they're replaced by a different person. And what happens is that we typically don't notice. And again, you don't believe me, but you go to YouTube, you can watch some of these demonstrations. They're classic examples of structured observations. Now, field experiments, and I gave you some examples of the helping research literature because these are some of the most straightforward but also really creative and elegant examples of field experimentation. And in this case, the researcher is actively manipulating independent variables in a variety of naturalistic settings in order to test what occurs. These are, as I mentioned earlier, very common in my discipline in social psychology. So for example, if I'm an altruism researcher and I know that in a laboratory I can show that the more people who are present when an emergency occurs, the longer it will take any one individual to do something about the emergency. So I know that. I'm going to go out in the field and I'm going to compare busy streets with quiet streets. So streets with a high density of people walking on them versus streets that have low traffic. So that's one variable I'm going to look at. I'm also going to manipulate the appearance of my quote-unquote victim. So for example, I could do this in a number of ways. I could manipulate the sex of my victim, who falls down on the street apparently unconscious. So I could have male victims, female victims. I could also manipulate how they're dressed. They could be dressed in business attire and appear to be, fairly well off. Or I could dress them in ragged clothing that appears to be dirty and disheveled. that I could further manipulate the person's appearance by having their hair be dirty or disheveled, or I could go all in and dump some whiskey on them, have them smell like they're drunk. And those are all manipulated variables that I can put out into the world. If we discredit the victim, so by dressing them with schematic representations of homelessness, for example, or other cues like dousing them in alcohol, the person may be assumed to be a homeless drunk, and they are more likely to be ignored, particularly in high-density environments where there's a lot of foot traffic. If, however, the person who passes out and falls down on the street appears to be well-dressed and doesn't have any other signifiers of social rejection, then they tend to get immediate assistance regardless of how dense the population. Slightly more slow when you have a lot of foot traffic, but much more direct assistance if the person appears to be clean and respectable. If, however, the person appears to be dirty, disheveled, or poor, and the person most likely to be ignored is someone who appears to be drunk or high. So you can see how in a field experiment like that, you're manipulating several variables simultaneously and then setting up observations and recording them from usually a distance so that you can time how fast it takes or how long it takes for people to render assistance, or you're also recording how many people are present and how many people might pass by the person. You also might record what kind of assistance they render. Do they whip out a phone and just stand off at the distance, or do they want to render immediate direct aid, checking on the person, for example? So those are all examples of field experiments. And that concludes part one. Next time we'll finish out our discussion of observational methods in part two.